This is another discussion of Rabbi Wolf Leiter and the Gedolim, and they were Gedolim, true Gedolim, luminaries in and outside the Jewish persuasions, okay, that we all know. There was Rabbi Professor Lieberman at JTS, and he had become acquainted with my father's writings back in the 30s when he saw the Beth David, and he wrote a rather lengthy letter to him in Torah, in other words, a Torah discussion, brought up certain issues. And from that time on, after he reached the States, at that time he was still in Israel, working at the Harry Fischel Institute, that is Professor Lieberman, doing his work there. But he found it necessary to leave because he was concerned about what was going on during those years. In the early 40s, there were many people who felt it might be a little healthier to be on other shores, whether they were Orthodox, conservative, or Reform. Hitler did not differentiate. Okay? In any case, I'd like to just give you over a few vignettes. I recall going with my father in 1963 to the seminary, and we came into the room where Professor Lieberman was working, and he had about 30 different Svarim laid out on tables, all books, Jewish law, etc., and learning, and probably extensive material from other sources too. And my father remarked on that I could see you're very much involved in the learning of our sages. And I could distinctly remember Rabbi Lieberman saying, well, like in Galicia, there was the great sage, the head of the Lemberg rabbinate, the Sholem Rabbi Nathanson, Rabbi Shol Nathanson, once said, I could not be Mekayim, the first mitzvah. I could not do the first mitzvah, which is Peru Vu, to be fruitful and multiply. He had no children. So he said on himself, I could not be Mekayim, the first mitzvah, so I'm trying to be Mekayim, the last one, to write, the Sefer Torah, just as Rabbi Nathanson had said about himself. I recall it distinctly. It was a very touching thing that he felt very strongly about. It was an immediate answer. He didn't seem to have to think about it. It just seemed to come very naturally to him. In any case, my father explained to him that one of the reasons he was in New York was because he had material from my grandfather, Rabbi Nosson Nota, 30 responsa. And he was going to print them finally, because this is all that remained from him. My grandfather was killed in the Holocaust, as I've mentioned in other tapes that we have of these videos. And he was wanting my father to print them and give it a certain name, Tzion L'Nefesh Chaya, because he wanted to memorialize his mother, that is Rabbi Nosson Nota, my father's grandmother. And my father because there was only 30 responsa, he wanted it to be a sefer, not just a monograph. So he added many tshuvas of his own, many, many important, very critically important in the work that he'd been doing for years into this sefer. He calls it the sefer of his grandfather, not his own, but he mentions that it's appended, there's these tshuvas, and he explains in the Hagdoma, in the introduction, he wanted to give it a toughness sefer. He wanted to give it, make it look like a regular sefer. It should be a little bit more substantial looking. it shouldn't get lost as another monograph. And in there were Hagoyas and all kinds of writings about the Chassam Sofer and the Marie Cologne, 30 pages. I've mentioned that already before. There's about 3,000 sources dealing with where the Marie Cologne is brought down, okay? And he's a critical person in the Shelsheles of Halacha that we've discussed at length in our first several tapes, okay? Our first how should we say, YouTube tapes. This is a major, major work, and I hope someday some people will be able to help us go through all those 3,000 sources, which my father has mentioned briefly, which happens to be in the Leiter-Shelsheles, which was printed together with the notes and Ha'oris, how should we say, different questions and answers, etc., of the Gedolei Yisrael, namely the Chavis Yor and the Zayas Ranon and the Shagis Aryeh and the Beis Meir. So it was printed in this particular volume that came out in the I believe it was in the 80s or 90s. Maybe it was, and it's a major, major work. And my father had always said he hoped that these things would be printed along with the Marik, and they were, in fact, more than once, but in this case, together with this he's listed in the panorama of the greatest of the great among our Jewish people. He was discussing this with Lieberman, that he's going to be putting these things in, and then he asked him, I have an item that I wrote to about the Nefesh Chaya, not the Tzion LaNefesh Chaya, but there was a book Nefesh Chaya put out by our good friend and a bookie of some renown, and I'll give you his name later, in which he brings down where many of the authorities over the centuries neglected to bring down certain sources. And many of these items that he is mentioning happen to be already discussed by previous authors. In other words, he did a little bit of plagiarizing, our good friend, who's also a member of the Bikiyim Club. Several hundred places in an extremely thin volume, very thin. And Professor Lieberman said in his Litvische Yiddish, müsst es updrücken. He felt that the works that he's putting out among the Tshuvas, my father should mention this too. After all, plagiarism should not go unheeded completely. Well, there's an addendum to this. The next day, my father was sitting with Rabbi Menachem Mendel Kasher, who was going to undertake to print the Tzion LaNefesh Chaya, and it was printed in 1964. I reprinted it, in 2014. I had somebody put in all the biography there. However, the Sefer itself, with my grandfather's Shuvas and my father's Shuvas, was printed then, and the Shuvas on the Marik, and et cetera, the Rashbash, the Rakeach, all of it was in there. And that Shuvah was also supposed to be in there, according to Professor Lieberman, Rabbi Lieberman. Well, when we met with Rabbi Menachem Mendel Kasher the next day, my father mentioned to him again what he had told Rabbi Lieberman, that there was some plagiarism there in the Sefer called Nefesh Chaya that was, printed by this gentleman in Poland and brought to my father's attention by his father and said, Sedach Tzachmir, we think so-and-so has been lakhaning, plagiarizing a little bit. So Menachem Mendel Kasher heard what my father said, and it's like I heard an echo. He said to my father, Ihr müsst es updrücken. It sounded like an echo of the day before. And by the way, he was very familiar with plagiarism. People had done a number on him years before already with some of the important work he did. You should know, of course, I'm sure most of you will know, the Torah Shlema, a magnificent idea, a magnificent work that he was embarked on for decades. That was the work, the major work of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Kasher, and he had a whole group of scholars working with him, and he had a son who was unbelievably gaonish in his temperament and his abilities and his intellect, who worked on the Tzion L'Nefesh Chaya, because as I've mentioned before, my father's eyes were gone then as far as reading galleys. He was learning all the time, and like this, but he used to complain to me he couldn't see the whole page the way he used to. He had cataract operations in the 50s already. But be that as it may, that's what happened with these two people. At the same time, we were at Menachem Mendel Kasher's apartment on the west side. He showed us things from the Rogatchover. Mind you, this is 63. And he had gotten a hold of it, and he showed my father the stuff that he had, all the things that had come into his hands, and how they were going to work on it. In fact, his son, Shlomo, a Gaonish person, worked on those for many, many years and very successfully putting them out. And he had the mind to be able to grasp the meaning and the direction and the understanding that could be imparted to others from the Rogatchover's writings, which is not an easy task. As my father had written, to just understand what he's saying, that is the Rogatchover, you really have to be somebody very, very special.